Have you ever considered how some conversations, hushed and hurried in the depths of night, could ripple through centuries, altering the very fabric of continents? Or how a simple choice, made by a young, hungry boy, might lead to an empire so vast it defies modern comprehension? It's a strange fact of history that the whispers of the past often roar loudest when you least expect them. Tonight, we're going to step into one such roaring tale, a saga of horseback warriors, political intrigue, and an ambition that reshaped the world. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you're settling in, let me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. Now, imagine yourself on the vast, windswept steppes of Central Asia, a place where the horizon stretches endlessly, meeting a sky so immense it seems to swallow the very earth. The air is sharp, carrying the scent of wild grasses and distant campfires. You're not a tourist here, clutching your phone for a quick selfie. No. You're a member of a nomadic tribe, your life dictated by the rhythm of seasons, the search for pasture, and the constant threat of rival clans. It's a harsh existence where survival is a daily struggle, and strength, cunning, and loyalty are your most valuable currencies. It's into this unforgiving world, around the year 1162, that a boy named Temüjin is born. His father, Yasuge, is a minor chieftain of the Borjigin clan, a branch of the wider Mongol tribe. Yasuge, a name that probably doesn't roll off the tongue quite like Genghis, was a man of some local renown, mostly for his ability to, shall we say, acquire resources from his neighbors. Temüjin's birth is said to have been auspicious, a blood clot clutched in his tiny fist, a sign, some believed, of his future as a warrior and a conqueror. Now, I'm not saying your baby will conquer the world if they come out holding a blood clot, but it certainly set the bar pretty high for Temüjin. Life, as you might guess, wasn't a bed of roses or even a comfortable yurt for young Temüjin. The Mongol tribes, while sharing a common language and culture, were constantly embroiled in petty feuds and brutal raids. It was less like a coherent nation and more like a collection of very aggressive, very well-mounted neighborhood associations, each convinced their barbecue pit was superior. When Temüjin was just 9 years old, a pivotal moment, perhaps the defining trauma of his early life, occurred. His father, Yasuge, was poisoned by a rival Tatar tribe. Yes, poisoned. Not in some grand battle, but during a deceptive feast, a grim reminder that trust was a luxury few could afford on the steppes. With Yasuge gone, his family, including Temüjin, his mother, Hohelun, and his younger siblings, were cast out. They became pariahs, stripped of their tribal protection and left to fend for themselves. You can picture it, right? Imagine losing your primary provider, your protector, and suddenly, you're not just struggling, you're invisible, a target for every opportunistic bandit and rival. They endured years of abject poverty, surviving on roots, fish, and small game. It was a time of immense hardship, forging in Temüjin a steely resilience and a deep understanding of betrayal and loyalty. Historians still argue whether this early abandonment was the singular most significant factor in shaping his future ambition, or if it merely accelerated a destiny already brewing. Either way, it left an indelible mark. It was during these lean years that Temüjin learned the ruthless realities of survival. He even killed his half-brother, Bektar, over a dispute about food, a stark illustration of the desperation and the brutal logic of their existence. This wasn't some casual sibling rivalry over who got the last cookie. This was a fight for literal sustenance, a choice between your survival and theirs. It's a sobering thought, isn't it? That the man who would command vast armies once fought for scraps of food with his own kin. This period was his grim university, teaching him about human nature, power dynamics, and the critical importance of allies. He experienced capture and escape, further honing his cunning and resourcefulness. You might say he got a master's degree in street smarts, step addition. These formative experiences, the loss of his father, the betrayal by his own clan, and the constant struggle for survival, collectively hardened Temüjin. They instilled in him an unshakable resolve and a profound desire for stability and order, not just for himself, but for his people. He understood, deeply and intuitively, that the incessant tribal feuding was a weakness, a drain on their collective strength, leaving them vulnerable to larger, more organized powers. This realization, born from personal suffering, would become the bedrock of his vision for a united Mongol nation. He wasn't just dreaming of revenge. He was dreaming of peace through overwhelming force. A bit of an oxymoron, perhaps, but it worked for him. From the ashes of his personal tragedy, Temüjin began to forge a new path. He wasn't just surviving anymore. He was strategizing, building connections, and learning the intricate dance of steppe politics. You see, while he was an outcast, he wasn't entirely without resources or friends. He had the unwavering loyalty of his mother, Öhelun, a truly formidable woman who had kept her children alive through sheer force of will. He also had a few childhood friends, notably Bo-Ochu and Jelme, who would become his most trusted companions and generals. The kind of ride-or-die friends who'd help you move a body, metaphorically speaking, of course. One of his most significant early alliances was with Jamuka, his anda or blood brother. This was more than just a casual friendship. It was a sacred bond forged through shared rituals and vows. Imagine it, two young men, both ambitious, both skilled, swearing eternal loyalty under the vast sky. For a time, their destinies seemed intertwined, and they rode together, raiding and building their strength. Jamuka was charismatic and a natural leader, and for a while, he and Temüjin were a formidable duo. But as you might suspect, when two alpha wolves share a den, things can get a little tense. The turning point in their relationship, and indeed in Temüjin's rise, came when he sought to recover his captured wife, Berte. She had been abducted by a rival Merkid tribe, a common and utterly terrifying occurrence in those days. Temüjin, consumed by grief and rage, sought help from Tughrul, the powerful Khan of the Karaite tribe, who had once been an ally of Temüjin's father. This act of appealing to a stronger power, demonstrating both humility and strategic thinking, was crucial. Tughrul, impressed by Temüjin's courage and perhaps seeing an opportunity to expand his own influence, agreed to help. With Tughrul's forces and Jamuka's assistance, Berta was rescued. This successful raid cemented Temüjin's reputation as a leader who protected his own. and one who knew how to leverage alliances. However, the rescue of Berta also inadvertently highlighted the growing differences between Temüjin and Jamuka. While they were under, their leadership styles and visions for the future diverged. Jamuka preferred the traditional nomadic way of life, with its constant raiding and fluid alliances. Temüjin, scarred by the instability of his youth, yearned for something more permanent. A structured society where law, not endless feuding, prevailed. Historians still argue whether their split was inevitable due to their differing philosophies, or if it was simply a matter of two strong personalities eventually clashing for ultimate supremacy. Regardless, their paths diverged, setting them on a collision course. The rift between them widened, leading to open conflict. Temüjin, with his growing number of loyal followers, began to attract warriors and families who were tired of the constant strife and sought the stability he promised. He offered a radical idea that loyalty should be to the leader, not just to one's immediate clan. This was revolutionary, threatening the established tribal order where clan ties were paramount. He also implemented a system where spoils of war were distributed more equitably, ensuring that everyone, not just the chieftains, benefited. This was a stroke of genius, incentivizing loyalty and hard work. Think of it as an early, very violent form of profit sharing. The struggle for dominance was fierce. Temüjin fought a series of crucial battles against various tribal confederations, including the Tatars, the very tribe who had poisoned his father. This was more than just revenge. It was about systematically eliminating threats and absorbing their strength. He employed clever tactics, such as the use of disciplined units and swift maneuvers, which were often superior to the more disorganized charges of his enemies. He wasn't just a brute, he was a master tactician, a chess player on horseback. One particularly significant victory was against the Karait, his former allies under Togrul. The relationship had soured as Togrul grew wary of Temüjin's rising power. Temüjin, now confident in his own strength, decisively defeated the Karait, integrating many of their warriors into his own burgeoning army. This victory eliminated a major rival and significantly bolstered his forces. It's a bit like when you finally decide to cut ties with that one friend who's always just a little bit too competitive. Liberating, but with higher stakes than just who gets to pick the movie. Finally, the ultimate showdown came with Jamuka. Their rivalry had become personal, a contest for the soul of the Mongol people. In a decisive battle, Temüjin's forces prevailed. Jamuka, betrayed by his own followers, was captured and brought before Temüjin. In a gesture that speaks volumes about their complex relationship, Temüjin offered Jamuka reconciliation, a chance to reunite their bond. But Jamuka, perhaps too proud or too committed to the old ways, refused. He requested an honorable death without the shedding of blood, a wish Temüjin granted. This act, while still brutal, demonstrated Temüjin's capacity for both ruthlessness and a certain grim respect for his adversaries, particularly those he once held dear. By methodically defeating and integrating the various Mongol tribes, Temüjin was doing something unprecedented. He wasn't just conquering, he was unifying. He was breaking down the ancient clan barriers, forcing disparate groups to see themselves as part of a larger whole. He was laying the groundwork for a truly unified Mongol nation, something that had never existed before. It was a Herculean task, achieved through a blend of military prowess, strategic alliances, and a relentless focus on loyalty and discipline. He was building an empire, one skirmish, one broken alliance, and one unified tribe at a time. With Jamaica subdued and the major tribal confederations either defeated or absorbed, the stage was set for Temüjin's grandest act. The year is now 1206. You're part of a vast assembly, an enormous gathering of the Mongol tribes known as a Kurultai, convened near the sacred source of the Onon River. The air hums with anticipation, a mix of awe and trepidation. Warriors, elders, and leaders from every corner of the steppe are present, their faces etched with the sun and wind, their eyes fixed on the man who had, against all odds, brought them together. This wasn't just a political meeting. It was a religious and spiritual affirmation. The Mongols believed in Tengri, the eternal blue sky, and success was often interpreted as divine favor. Temüjin had not only triumphed militarily, but had seemingly been blessed by the heavens themselves. Imagine the scene: banners fluttering, horses neighing, the murmur of thousands of voices. Then silence descends as Temüjin, now in his mid-40s, a seasoned warrior and strategist, steps forward. He stands before them, not as a chieftain of a single clan, but as the orchestrator of their unity, the architect of their newfound strength. At this monumental Kurultai, Temüjin was formally proclaimed Genghis Khan. This wasn't just a new name, it was a title of immense power and significance. Genghis is often translated as universal ruler or oceanic ruler, signifying a boundless dominion. Khan simply means leader. So, in essence, he became the universal leader of the Mongols, a name that would soon strike terror and awe across continents. This wasn't a democratic election, but a ratification, a powerful symbolic act that unified their disparate identities under one singular overarching authority. It was the moment the Mongol Empire was truly born, not just as a collection of tribes, but as a recognized entity. With his new title came new responsibilities and, crucially, a new legal code, the Yassa. This wasn't some flimsy set of suggestions. It was a comprehensive body of laws, decrees, and edicts designed to govern every aspect of Mongol life, from military organization to hunting regulations, from social conduct to justice. The Yassa was written down, an astonishing feat for a traditionally oral society, demonstrating a shift towards more sophisticated governance. It decreed strict punishments for theft, dishonesty, and disobedience, aiming to eliminate the very feuding and disunity that had plagued the Mongols for centuries. Historians still debate the precise scope and influence of the written Yassa versus the unwritten customary laws, but its existence clearly marked a fundamental change in Mongol society. The Yassa also codified Temüjin's, now Genghis Khan's, vision for a meritocracy. Promotion in the army and administration was based on skill and loyalty, not on aristocratic birth or tribal affiliation. This was revolutionary. Imagine a system where your background didn't matter, as much as your ability to ride, shoot, and follow orders. It meant that a humble shepherd could rise to command legions, provided he proved himself worthy. This policy attracted talent and ensured that the most capable individuals were in positions of power, a crucial factor in the empire's rapid expansion. It also fostered incredible loyalty to Genghis Khan himself, as individuals owed their rise directly to him. Under Genghis Khan, the military was completely reorganized. No longer were armies simply tribal levies fighting under their own chiefs. The army was now centrally commanded, divided into decimal units, groups of 10, Arban, 100, Jagan, 1,000, Mingan, and 10,000, Tumen. This hierarchical structure ensured discipline, efficient communication, and rapid deployment. Commanders were personally appointed by Genghis Khan and held accountable directly to him. The mobility and coordination of this new army were unparalleled, allowing them to cover vast distances at incredible speed and strike with devastating force. Think of it as the ultimate express delivery service. But instead of packages, they delivered conquest. Another critical innovation was the integration of conquered peoples. Instead of simply plundering and abandoning territories, Genghis Khan often absorbed skilled individuals, engineers, artisans, and even warriors into his own forces. If you were a talented craftsman or a particularly good archer from a defeated tribe, you weren't necessarily slaughtered. You might find yourself working for the new boss. This practical approach not only swelled his ranks, but also provided him with diverse expertise, from siege engineering to administrative techniques, further strengthening his burgeoning empire. It was a pragmatic approach that recognized the value of human capital, even from former enemies. This period also saw the development of a postal system, the Yam, using relay stations and swift riders to transmit information across the vast distances of the empire. This communication network was vital for maintaining control, coordinating military movements, and gathering intelligence. It was the ancient world's internet, except instead of cat videos, you got urgent military dispatches and perhaps the occasional request for more yak butter. So by 1206, Genghis Khan had not only unified the Mongols, but had laid the institutional groundwork for an empire. He had established a legal code, reformed the military, adopted a meritocratic system, and begun to integrate conquered populations and technologies. He had transformed a collection of squabbling nomadic tribes into a disciplined, formidable, and highly mobile war machine, with a clear chain of command and a grand vision. This wasn't just about winning battles. It was about building a lasting structure, a foundation strong enough to support the ambitions of a universal ruler. With the Mongols unified and the Yassa in place, Genghis Khan wasn't content to simply rule his newly forged nation. The steppes, while vast, offered limited resources, and the new, powerful military needed an outlet, a purpose. You can almost hear the rumble of anticipation from the Tumens, itching for action. Their eyes, and indeed Genghis Khan's, turned outward, beyond the familiar grasslands, towards the settled, wealthier civilizations that bordered their lands. Their first major target, the Western Xia dynasty, also known as the Temüjin Empire. Imagine a powerful, sophisticated kingdom nestled in what is now northwestern China, straddling the Silk Road. The Western Xia, with its capital at Hinchuan, was a formidable state, boasting walled cities, a rich agricultural base, and a professional army. They controlled vital trade routes, which meant wealth, but also made them a tempting target for a hungry, newly organized empire. For Genghis Khan, the Western Xia served multiple purposes. It was a rich prize, a strategic pathway to the even wealthier Jin Dynasty further east, and a perfect testing ground for his newly disciplined army. It was like their first big exam after years of intense study. The Mongols launched their first major campaign against the Western Xia in 1209. You might think of nomadic warriors as simply charging across open plains, but Genghis Khan understood the need for adaptability. His army, while supremely skilled at cavalry maneuvers, quickly learned the complexities of siege warfare. This wasn't something they were naturally good at, but they learned, often by employing captured engineers and artisans, demonstrating that pragmatic integration of skills we talked about earlier. They'd use captured populations to build siege engines or divert rivers, which, let's be honest, is a pretty intimidating way to ask someone to surrender. Nice city you've got there. Be a shame if something happened to its water supply. The initial campaigns were swift and brutal. The Mongols bypassed strong fortifications where possible, targeting the countryside, destroying crops, and cutting off supplies to the cities. This strategy was designed to break the enemy's will to resist and force them into open battle, where the Mongol cavalry had the advantage. You see, the Mongols didn't just want to win, they wanted to demoralize. They understood that fear could be a weapon as potent as any arrow. The Western Xia put up a valiant fight. Their cities were well fortified, and their armies were experienced. But the Mongols' relentless pressure, their ability to move quickly and unexpectedly, and their utter disregard for conventional warfare slowly wore them down. One notable tactic involved diverting the Yellow River to flood the Western Xia capital, an audacious move that nearly worked. While the flood ultimately failed due to an engineering miscalculation. Oops! It showcased the Mongols' innovative, if destructive, approach to warfare. The Tangids, facing a protracted struggle and significant losses, eventually sought peace. In 1210, the Western Xia ruler submitted to Genghis Khan, acknowledging him as his suzerain and agreeing to pay tribute, including camels, falcons, and even a daughter of the ruling house to seal the alliance. This was a significant victory, not just for the loot, but for the prestige. It demonstrated to the world that the unified Mongols were a force to be reckoned with, capable of conquering established empires. It also provided Genghis Khan with valuable resources, including siege engineers and administrators who would prove invaluable in future campaigns. However, the Western Xia's loyalty was always precarious. They were a powerful kingdom, and subservience didn't sit well with them. This uneasy truce would simmer for years, periodically erupting into renewed conflict. Genghis Khan, with his characteristic strategic foresight, knew that the Western Xia, positioned as they were, could prove to be a dangerous, unreliable rearguard if he turned his attention further east. Historians still argue whether Genghis Khan's ultimate destruction of the Western Xia was purely punitive for their rebellions, or a preemptive measure to secure his western flank before his final great campaigns. The campaigns against Western Xia, despite their strategic importance, were not without challenges. The terrain was often difficult, and the Mongols encountered stubborn resistance. It was a learning experience, refining their tactics for dealing with fortified cities and demonstrating the need for a comprehensive approach that combined devastating cavalry charges with patient siegecraft. It was here that the Mongol army truly evolved beyond a purely nomadic fighting force. In the end, the repeated rebellions of the Western Xia would seal their fate. Genghis Khan, towards the very end of his life, would launch a final, devastating campaign against them. This time, there would be no truce, no submission. The Western Xia would be utterly destroyed, their cities razed, their culture eradicated to such an extent that for centuries, even their written language was a mystery to scholars. It was a brutal lesson in the consequences of defying the universal ruler. The initial victory in 1210, however, marked the first major step outward for the Mongol Empire, a successful test run that proved their military might and laid the groundwork for even grander conquests. With the Western Xia humbled and providing a vital western buffer, Genghis Khan's gaze, ever outward, now fell upon a far grander prize, the mighty Jin Dynasty. Imagine, if you will, the most powerful and sophisticated empire in East Asia at the time, stretching across northern China, encompassing bustling cities, fertile farmlands, and a population numbering in the tens of millions. This was no mere tribal kingdom. This was a true empire, with an established bureaucracy, formidable armies, and vast resources. Conquering the Jin was not just an ambition, it was a declaration of the Mongols' unparalleled power. It was like going from beating the local high school team to taking on the reigning world champions. The Jin dynasty, ruled by the Jurchens, had themselves conquered much of northern China from the Song dynasty just a century earlier. They were, in their own right, a martial people, experienced in warfare and fortified behind immense defensive structures, including a proto-great wall system designed to keep out northern nomads, including the Mongols. Their capital, Zhongdu, modern-day Beijing, was a marvel of the age, a sprawling metropolis with massive walls. For the Mongols, this was the ultimate challenge, a test of whether their nomadic prowess could truly overcome the might of a settled, technologically advanced empire. The first major Mongol incursions into Jin territory began in 1211. You might picture the Mongols simply riding in, but the reality was far more strategic. Genghis Khan understood the sheer scale of the challenge. He employed a strategy of relentless raids, probing weaknesses, and disrupting the Jin's economy and military infrastructure. They targeted agricultural lands, disrupting food supplies, and ambushed Jin armies, avoiding large-scale pitched battles where the Jin might bring their numerical superiority to bear. This was psychological warfare as much as it was military. The Jin defenses, while impressive on paper, were often poorly coordinated. Their vast army, comprised of both Jurchen and Han Chinese soldiers, suffered from internal divisions and a general lack of effective leadership compared to the unified Mongol command. You see, while the Jin had numbers, the Mongols had a single, terrifying vision, executed with ruthless efficiency. It's like having a dozen separate departments trying to put out a fire versus a single, highly trained SWAT team. The campaigns were grueling. The Mongols encountered formidable resistance, particularly when attempting to take walled cities. Remember our discussion about siege warfare? This is where those lessons truly paid off. The Mongols used a variety of tactics: starvation sieges, where they simply surrounded a city and waited for its inhabitants to run out of food; psychological warfare, parading captured prisoners or displaying heads on pikes; and crucially, employing captured engineers to build catapults, trebuchets, and other siege engines. They also perfected the art of human shields, forcing captured civilians or even enemy soldiers to lead the charge against their own city walls. It was brutal, efficient, and horrifyingly effective. One of the most famous and devastating engagements was the Battle of Badger Mouth, Khwarazmian, in 1211. Here, Genghis Khan skillfully lured a large Jin army into a narrow valley, a classic ambush scenario. The Mongols, using their superior maneuverability and disciplined archers, decimated the Jin forces. This wasn't just a victory, it was a rout, crippling a significant portion of the Jin's main field army and opening up the path deeper into their territory. It sent shivers down the spine of the Jin leadership, proving that their formidable numbers were no match for Mongol tactics and ferocity. By 1213, Genghis Khan had effectively encircled Zhongdu, the Jin capital. The city was immense, its walls seemingly impregnable. The Mongols, however, did not attempt a full-scale assault immediately. Instead, they laid siege, tightening the noose, cutting off supplies, and terrorizing the surrounding countryside. The conditions inside the city became desperate, with famine and disease taking a heavy toll. Stories abound of cannibalism among the starving inhabitants, a testament to the horrific suffering endured during these sieges. Historians still argue whether the Mongols intended to take Zhongdu by storm, or if their primary goal was always to force a surrender through attrition and terror. Eventually, the Jin Emperor Xuanzong was forced to negotiate for peace. He offered a staggering tribute: gold, silver, silks, thousands of horses, and even members of the imperial family. Genghis Khan, ever the pragmatist, accepted. This wasn't a sign of weakness, but a strategic pause. He extracted immense wealth, weakened the Jin, and gained time to regroup and resupply his forces. He then withdrew, leaving the Jin greatly diminished, but not entirely destroyed. However, the peace was short-lived. Emperor Xuanzong, fearing another Mongol attack on Zhongdu, made a fatal error. He moved his capital south to Kaifeng. This was perceived by Genghis Khan as a betrayal, a clear sign that the Jin were not truly submitting and were preparing for renewed conflict. For Genghis Khan, promises were sacred, and this move was a breach of faith. He immediately renewed his offensive in 1215, directing his forces once more towards Zhongdu, which, now less defended, quickly fell. The city was plundered and razed, a chilling warning to anyone who dared defy the Khan. The fall of Zhongdu was a monumental symbolic victory. It shattered the illusion of Jin invincibility and solidified the Mongols' reputation as an unstoppable force. While the Jin dynasty would continue to exist for another 2 decades, clinging to power in the south, its heartland was broken, its prestige shattered. The campaigns against the Jin were long, arduous, and incredibly destructive, but they provided the Mongols with invaluable experience in large-scale warfare against a settled empire. Lessons they would apply with devastating effect in their future conquests. With the Jin Dynasty crippled, though not yet fully extinguished, Genghis Khan's strategic mind, always restless, shifted its focus westward. You're now sensing a different kind of tension in the air, a distant rumbling that promises new, even grander conquests. The target, the immense and fabulously wealthy Khwarazmian Empire. This was a vast Islamic empire stretching across Central Asia, from modern-day Iran to Afghanistan and parts of Uzbekistan and Turkmenistan, a land of ancient cities, thriving trade routes, and immense cultural richness. It was a bridge between East and West, a jewel on the Silk Road, and unfortunately for them, right in the Mongols' line of sight. The initial relationship between the Mongols and Khwarezmians was, surprisingly, one of tentative diplomacy. Genghis Khan, ever pragmatic, saw the value of trade. He dispatched a large caravan laden with valuable goods towards the Khwarezmian capital, ostensibly seeking to open trade relations. This wasn't just about business. It was also a test, a probing of the waters, and perhaps a subtle display of Mongol wealth and potential. Imagine a fleet of trucks, but instead of consumer goods, it's furs, silks, and gold, all under the banner of a rapidly expanding empire. However, the Khwarezmian Shah, Ala al-Din Muhammad II, proved to be a man of disastrous judgment. Perhaps arrogant in his empire's power, or deeply suspicious of the nomadic barbarians, he made a series of catastrophic decisions. When the Mongol trade caravan arrived at the city of Otrar in 1218, the governor, Inalchuk, accused the merchants of being spies, and without the Shah's explicit order, but certainly with his tacit approval, seized their goods and executed the entire delegation. This was an unthinkable insult, a direct affront to Genghis Khan's authority and a blatant violation of diplomatic norms. You don't just casually execute a powerful Khan's envoys. That's like kicking a sleeping dragon. Genghis Khan, surprisingly, gave the Shah a chance to rectify the situation. He sent a small diplomatic mission to the Shah, demanding the surrender and punishment of Inalchuk. But again, Shah Muhammad's arrogance prevailed. Not only did he refuse, but he reportedly had the chief Mongol envoy beheaded and the beards of the other two singed, a deliberate and grave humiliation. This was the ultimate red line. For Genghis Khan, whose word and honor were paramount, this was an act of war, an unforgivable offense that demanded total retaliation. In 1219, the full fury of the Mongol war machine was unleashed upon the Khwarazmian Empire. This wasn't just a punitive raid. It was an invasion of unprecedented scale, orchestrated with terrifying precision. Genghis Khan personally led a massive force, estimated at over 100,000 to 200,000 warriors, arguably the largest army yet assembled by the Mongols. They advanced on multiple fronts, employing their signature tactics of speed, deception, and overwhelming force. The Khwarazmian Empire, despite its size and wealth, was internally weak. Shah Muhammad had dispersed his large army across various cities, a common but ultimately fatal mistake against the Mongols. He feared losing his prestige if he risked a single decisive battle, and lost. But this strategy allowed the Mongols to isolate and systematically destroy his forces piece by piece. Historians still argue whether the Shah's strategy was born of fatal arrogance or a genuine miscalculation of Mongol capabilities. But the outcome was undeniable. The invasion began with the siege of Otra, the city where the envoys had been murdered. The siege lasted for months, a grim testament to the Mongols' patience and determination. Once the city fell, Inalchuk was captured and reportedly executed by having molten silver poured into his eyes and ears. A chillingly poetic justice for a man who had coveted the silver of the Mongol merchants. Other cities fell with brutal efficiency. Bukhara, Samarkand, Urgench, these were vibrant centers of Islamic learning and commerce, now reduced to rubble and ash. The Mongols' methods were terrifyingly effective. They offered cities the chance to surrender. If they surrendered peacefully, they might be spared, though often forced to pay heavy tribute and provide skilled laborers or soldiers. If they resisted, the consequences were dire. Entire populations were often massacred, their cities razed to the ground, leaving behind only pyramids of skulls as a stark warning. This policy of deliberate terror, while horrific, was highly effective in encouraging future cities to capitulate without a fight. Imagine the psychological impact of knowing that resistance meant utter annihilation. Shah Muhammad, utterly outmaneuvered and terrified, fled across his empire, pursued relentlessly by Mongol detachments, including a famous chase led by the brilliant general Subutai. He eventually died a lonely death on an island in the Caspian Sea, his empire crumbling around him. His son, Jalal al-Din Mingburnu, attempted to mount a spirited resistance, proving himself a capable warrior. But even his bravery could not stem the Mongol tide. The invasion of the Khwarazmian Empire was one of the most destructive military campaigns in history. It resulted in the devastation of vast swathes of Central Asia, the collapse of a major Islamic power, and the deaths of millions. But for the Mongols, it was a resounding success. They had secured immense wealth, gained invaluable experience in large-scale urban warfare, and eliminated a powerful rival. More importantly, it established their reputation as an unstoppable force, capable of utterly destroying any who dared to defy them. The doors to the West were now wide open, and the world would soon learn the true meaning of universal ruler. With the Khwarazmian Empire annihilated, the western frontier of the Mongol domain stretched far into lands previously unknown to them. Genghis Khan, now satisfied with the punishment meted out and the vast wealth acquired, began his return journey eastward. But before he left, he dispatched a legendary reconnaissance mission, an epic ride into the unknown that would forever etch the names of his generals into military history. You're talking about the famous Great Raid, led by two of his most brilliant and daring commanders, Subutai and Jebe. Imagine the audacity of it. Two Tumans, perhaps 20,000 to 30,000 warriors, dispatched on a deep reconnaissance mission, not just for a few weeks, but for years, covering thousands of miles across uncharted territory. Their mission was to scout the lands beyond the Caspian Sea, to gather intelligence on potential new enemies, and to sow terror and confusion. This wasn't a full-scale invasion, but a scouting party that turned into a whirlwind of conquest. It's like sending out a drone, but the drone is actually a highly trained, heavily armed cavalry division. Subutai, often considered one of the greatest military strategists in history, was a master of grand strategy and logistics. Jebe, on the other hand, was renowned for his aggressive tactics and unparalleled horsemanship. Together, they were a perfectly balanced, utterly devastating team. They swept north through Persia, then into the Caucasus region, encountering various kingdoms and peoples who had no idea what was about to hit them. The Mongols moved with incredible speed, often appearing as if from nowhere, bypassing fortifications and striking at the heart of their opponents. Their initial targets in the Caucasus included the kingdoms of Georgia and the Cumans, Kipchaks. The Georgians, a powerful Christian kingdom, were caught entirely off guard. In a series of devastating battles, the Mongols routed their forces, leaving a path of destruction in their wake. They didn't linger to conquer and administer. Their goal was information and terror, and they achieved both with chilling efficiency. Next, Subutai and Jebe turned their attention to the vast steppes north of the Black Sea, the domain of the Cumans. The Cumans, a nomadic Turkic people, were cousins of the Mongols in lifestyle, but they were no match for the disciplined and experienced Mongol army. Facing annihilation, the Cumans desperately appealed for help from the Rus's princes, the rulers of the fragmented principalities that would eventually form modern-day Russia and Ukraine. This plea for aid led to one of the most significant battles of this campaign, the Battle of the Kalka River in 1253. Imagine the scene. A combined Russes and Cuman army, a formidable force, confident in their numbers, arrayed against the seemingly smaller Mongol contingent. The Russes' princes, a diverse group, did not act with full unity, a fatal flaw that the Mongols, always keen observers of disunity, exploited masterfully. Historians still argue whether the Russes' princes truly understood the existential threat the Mongols posed, or if they underestimated them as just another nomadic raiding party. Subutai and Jebe employed a classic Mongol feigned retreat. They engaged the Russes and Cuman vanguard, then pretended to flee, drawing the eager but undisciplined combined army deeper and deeper into the steppe. For days, the Russes' forces pursued, stretching their lines, exhausting their horses and men, and slowly fragmenting their cohesion. When the Russes were finally strung out and vulnerable, the Mongols, who had conserved their strength, suddenly turned and attacked with full force. The ensuing battle was a complete rout. The Mongol cavalry, using their superior archery and maneuverability, systematically encircled and annihilated the Rus and Cuman forces. Many Rus's princes and nobles were captured or killed. The aftermath was particularly brutal. The captured princes were executed by being placed under a wooden platform upon which the Mongol generals feasted, slowly crushing them to death. This was a deliberate act of terror and humiliation, designed to send an unmistakable message about the cost of defiance. It probably tasted a bit like victory, with a hint of existential dread. After their victory at Kalka, Subutai and Jebe continued their reconnaissance, raiding into the Crimea, then turning east, riding along the Volga River, encountering and defeating the Volga Bulgars. they eventually circled back through Central Asia, having completed an astonishing journey of over 8,000 kilometers, around 5,000 miles, in just over 2 years. They returned to Genghis Khan in 1224, laden with intelligence about the rich lands to the west and the fragmented, disunited kingdoms that lay ripe for future conquest. The great raid of Subutai and Jebe was more than just a military excursion. It was a strategic masterpiece that showcased the Mongols' unparalleled mobility, their intelligence-gathering capabilities, and their devastating battlefield effectiveness. It provided Genghis Khan with crucial information about the vulnerabilities of Eastern Europe, knowledge that would be put to horrific use by his successors. It also left a lasting impression of terror in its wake, a chilling preview of the storms yet to come. It was a warning shot fired across a continent that had no idea of the true scale of the threat that had just briefly ridden through its lands. As Subutai and Jebe were charting the vulnerabilities of the West back in the heartland, Genghis Khan was solidifying his empire, preparing for the inevitable. But even the universal ruler was mortal. You are now witnessing the twilight of a colossal figure, the final acts of a man who reshaped the known world. By 1226, Genghis Khan was in his 60s, still campaigning, still strategizing, still ruthless. His final military endeavor was aimed at a familiar, frustrating foe, the Western Xia. Remember them? The Tangut kingdom that had submitted, paid tribute, then rebelliously refused to send troops for Genghis Khan's Khwarazmian campaign. That was a bridge too far for the great Khan. For him, a promise, especially a vassal's pledge of military aid, was inviolable. Their repeated insubordination was not just defiance, it was a challenge to the very foundation of his unified empire. He saw it as a necessary final act to secure his legacy and prevent future insubordination from any corner of his vast dominion. It was like a parent telling a particularly stubborn teenager, "This is the last time." The final campaign against the Western Xia was swift and utterly brutal. Genghis Khan, perhaps feeling his age or simply wanting to make an undeniable example, ordered a campaign of complete destruction. Cities that resisted were razed, populations massacred. The records paint a grim picture of systematic annihilation, so thorough that, as mentioned before, even the Tangut written language became a forgotten mystery for centuries. It was not just about winning a war. It was about erasing a disloyal entity from the map. It was during this campaign, in the late summer of 1227, that Genghis Khan himself fell ill. The exact circumstances of his death are shrouded in mystery and legend, contributing to the mystique of his legacy. Some accounts suggest he fell from his horse during a hunting accident. Others, that he succumbed to injuries sustained in battle. Or perhaps simply to the rigors of age and a demanding life. The Mongols, understanding the psychological impact of their leader's death, kept it a secret for weeks, even continuing the campaign against the Western Xia to ensure their complete destruction before the news became public. Imagine the sheer discipline to maintain such a monumental secret among thousands of warriors. Historians still argue whether the secrecy surrounding his death was purely tactical to complete the Western Xia destruction, or if it also reflected a deeper cultural reverence for the great Khan's departing spirit. Genghis Khan died in August 1227. His final instructions were simple but profound. The Western Xia must be utterly destroyed. His body was taken back to his homeland in Mongolia for burial. The location of his tomb remains one of history's greatest unsolved mysteries. Legend has it that all who witnessed his funeral procession, including the soldiers who escorted his body and the laborers who prepared his grave, were themselves killed to ensure the secrecy of his resting place. Rivers were even diverted over his burial site. It's the ultimate do not disturb sign. The immediate aftermath of Genghis Khan's death saw a period of transition, but not the collapse that often follows the death of a great conqueror. This was a testament to Genghis Khan's foresight and the strength of the institutions he had built. Unlike many empires that fragmented upon their founder's demise, the Mongol Empire remarkably continued to expand. This was due, in large part, to Genghis Khan's meticulous planning for succession. He had designated his third son, Ögedei, as his successor long before his death. This wasn't a last-minute decision. It was a carefully considered choice. Ögedei was known for his geniality, his diplomacy, and his ability to mediate among his ambitious brothers. Genghis Khan understood that while he had forged the empire through conquest, its continued existence would require a ruler capable of administration and consensus building among his fiercely independent sons and generals. He knew exactly what kind of person was needed to steer the ship once he was gone. His other sons and relatives were also granted specific territories, or ulus, to rule, creating the foundational structure of the future Khanates. Jochi, the eldest, received the westernmost lands, the future Golden Horde. Chagatai received Central Asia, and Tului, the youngest, inherited the Mongol homeland and the bulk of the Mongol armies as custom dictated. This division, while ensuring each son had a stake, also sowed the seeds for future rivalries and eventual fragmentation. But that was a problem for another day. For now, the system held. Genghis Khan's legacy is immense and paradoxical. He was a ruthless conqueror responsible for unimaginable destruction and the deaths of millions, yet he also laid the foundation for an empire that fostered unprecedented trade and cultural exchange across Eurasia. He was a barbarian in the eyes of many, yet he established a legal code, promoted meritocracy, and created one of the most sophisticated military and communication systems of his time. He unified disparate tribes and built an enduring political entity where none had existed before. You could say he was the ultimate disruptor, the kind of leader who completely rewrites the rules of the game, leaving everyone else scrambling to catch up. His vision, his discipline, and his strategic genius continue to drive the Mongol Empire even after his death. The world had braced for the roar of the great Khan, but it was his ghost, riding with his successors, that would continue to echo across the plains and into the walled cities of Eurasia. His spirit, it seemed, was still very much in charge. With Genghis Khan laid to rest in his secret tomb, the world held its breath, perhaps expecting the vast Mongol Empire to unravel. But you're about to witness a period of consolidation and even further expansion, a testament to the organizational genius of the great Khan and the careful succession planning he had put in place. His chosen successor, Ogedei Khan, was not the most fearsome warrior of his brothers, but he possessed something equally vital for an empire of such immense scale: administrative acumen and a genuinely affable, diplomatic personality. He was the glue that would hold the disparate parts together, at least for a while. Ogedei's reign from 1229 to 1241 marks a crucial period of institutionalization and continued outward growth for the Mongol Empire. Imagine taking a whirlwind of conquest and trying to turn it into something more stable, more enduring. That was Ogedei's challenge, and he met it with remarkable success. He understood that an empire couldn't run on fear alone. It needed structure, revenue, and effective governance. One of Ogedei's first major initiatives was to complete the conquest of the Jin Dynasty. Remember them? Still clinging on in southern China after Genghis Khan had crippled them. This final push, beginning in 1230, was a massive undertaking, requiring coordinated efforts from multiple Mongol armies, led by generals like Subutai. Yes, him again. He's basically the Mongol Empire's Swiss Army knife. The Jin, despite their weakened state, fought fiercely, demonstrating impressive resilience. They even employed early forms of gunpowder weapons, including fire lances and thunderclap bombs, showcasing a technological edge. But even proto-fireworks weren't enough against the relentless Mongol advance. In 1234, after a protracted and brutal siege, the Jin capital of Kaifeng finally fell. The last Jin emperor committed suicide, bringing an end to a dynasty that had ruled northern China for over a century. This was a monumental victory, not just militarily, but symbolically. It signaled the complete Mongol domination of northern China, providing them with immense resources, advanced technologies, and a massive pool of skilled labor and administrators. It was like finally getting your hands on the big prize after years of hard work. Ogedei, unlike his father, recognized the importance of rebuilding and administering conquered territories, rather than simply plundering them. He appointed competent administrators, often from diverse backgrounds, to manage the newly acquired lands. He established postal relay stations across the empire, expanding the yam system, ensuring swift communication and facilitating trade. He introduced a fixed tax system, replacing the erratic and often brutal demands of earlier campaigns, providing a more stable revenue stream for the empire. He even established a capital city, Karakorum, in Mongolia, transforming it from a nomadic encampment into a more permanent administrative center, complete with palaces, temples, and workshops. It was a conscious effort to transition from a purely nomadic war machine to a more settled imperial power. But Ogedei wasn't just a bureaucrat. He also presided over some of the most ambitious and far-reaching Mongol military campaigns. He recognized the intelligence gathered by Subutai and Jebe in the west, and he decided it was time to unleash the full force of the Mongol armies on Europe. This was a decision of truly global significance, one that would send shivers down the spine of medieval Europe. He gathered a massive army, including not only Mongols, but also contingents from various conquered peoples, and placed it under the overall command of his nephew, Batu Khan, the son of Jochi. Crucially, the brilliant Subutai was appointed as the principal military strategist, effectively running the show. This grand Western campaign, launched in 1236, aimed to conquer the Rus principalities and continue into Europe. It was a multi-pronged assault, meticulously planned, far more organized than a simple raiding party. While Ogadai himself remained in Karakoram, his strategic vision guided these massive military movements. Historians still debate how much direct control Ogadai exercised over these distant campaigns, or if he largely entrusted the operational details to his capable generals like Subutai. But his authority was clearly the driving force. Ogadai's reign also saw significant cultural exchange. As the empire grew, it brought together peoples from vastly different cultures: Chinese, Persian, Central Asian, European. While often brutal, this interaction led to the transfer of knowledge, technologies, and artistic styles across Eurasia. The Mongols, pragmatists that they were, readily adopted anything that could benefit their empire, from Chinese siege technology to Persian administrative techniques. However, Ogadai was not without his flaws. He was known for his generosity, but also for his heavy drinking, which eventually contributed to his deteriorating health. His death in 1241, unexpectedly and at a critical juncture of the European campaigns, would have profound consequences for the empire's trajectory, halting the advance into Western Europe. Ogadai Khan's reign was a pivotal period. He inherited a nascent empire forged by conquest and successfully began the arduous task of transforming it into a more stable, administered entity. He extended its reach, consolidated its gains, and ushered in an era of relative prosperity and unprecedented intercontinental exchange. He proved that the Mongol Empire was not just the creation of one man, but a robust system capable of continuing its expansion and development under capable leadership. As Ogadai Khan consolidated power in the east, the Grand Western Campaign, orchestrated under his command and led by the indefatigable Subutai and the nominal leader Batu Khan, was sweeping across the Rus' principalities. You are now witnessing the Mongol Tempest, a force that would utterly redefine the map of Eastern Europe and send shockwaves across the entire continent. Imagine the fear, the sheer panic, as news spread of an unstoppable horde, riding not for plunder alone, but for total subjugation. The invasion of the Rus' lands, beginning in 1236, was meticulously planned. The Mongol army, a multi-ethnic force of perhaps 20,000 to 150,000 men, was divided into several columns, each targeting different principalities. Their strategy was simple and terrifyingly effective: systematically conquer each city and region, leaving no unified resistance in their wake. The Rus' principalities, remember, were fragmented, constantly feuding amongst themselves, a fatal weakness the Mongols expertly exploited. It was like a dozen different little kingdoms, all arguing over whose turn it was to do the dishes, while a massive, unified army stood at their doorstep. The Mongols first struck at the Volga Bulgars, consolidating their flank before turning their full attention to the Rus lands. The winter of 1237-1238 saw the Mongols launch their assault, using the frozen rivers as highways for their cavalry, a brilliant tactical adaptation. City after city fell: Ryazan, Kolomna, Moscow, Vladimir, and then the mighty Kiev. The sieges were brutal, often ending in massacres designed to terrorize any future resistance. The Mongols were not interested in taking prisoners, at least not until they had proven their point. The Russ's cities, despite their strong wooden walls and valiant defenders, were generally unprepared for the scale and sophistication of Mongol siege warfare. The Mongols used catapults, trebuchets, and ramming machines, often constructed on site by captured engineers, to breach walls. They also employed psychological warfare, sending envoys to demand surrender, knowing full well that resistance meant utter annihilation. The accounts of the destruction are harrowing. Entire populations put to the sword, buildings razed, cultural treasures destroyed. Kiev, once a magnificent center of Russia's culture and religion, was famously reduced to rubble, a grim symbol of Mongol might. By 1240, the heartland of Russes was devastated. The principalities were either conquered outright or forced into tributary status, becoming vassals of the emerging Mongol state in the west, which would later be known as the Golden Horde. The cultural and political landscape of Eastern Europe was irrevocably altered. This was not just a temporary raid. It was a permanent change in the power dynamics of the region. But the Mongols did not stop there. Under Subutai's strategic direction, the armies pushed further west in 1241, crossing the Carpathian Mountains and entering Central Europe. The target was now the kingdoms of Hungary and Poland, which represented the easternmost bulwarks of Catholic Europe. The Europeans, meanwhile, were largely oblivious to the true nature of the threat. They often viewed the Mongols as just another wave of nomadic raiders, or even as a scourge sent by God. The Mongols launched a coordinated, two-pronged attack. One force, primarily under the command of Kaidu, a Mongol general, not the future Khan, struck north into Poland, aiming to prevent Polish and Bohemian forces from assisting Hungary. This led to the Battle of Legnica on April 9, 1241. Here, a combined army of Poles, Germans, and various European knights, led by Duke Henry II, the Pious of Silesia, met the Mongol vanguard. The Mongols, again employing feigned retreats and their disciplined archery, utterly annihilated the European forces. Duke Henry himself was killed, and his head was reportedly paraded on a pike. It was a crushing defeat for the European crusading forces, revealing their tactical inferiority against the Mongol war machine. Imagine the shock, the terror, as news of this devastating loss spread westward. Simultaneously, the main Mongol army, led by Batu Khan and Subutai, pushed into Hungary. The Hungarians, under King Bela IV, attempted to gather their forces, but like the Russ's princes, they were slow to react and suffered from internal divisions. The decisive engagement came at the Battle of Mohi, also known as the Battle of the Sajo River, on April 11, 1241, just 2 days after Legnica. At Mohi, the Hungarian army was encamped, seemingly secure behind a river and marshland. Subutai, with his unparalleled tactical genius, devised a plan to cross the river under cover of darkness, using catapults to create a terrifying barrage of stones and creek fire, though likely naphtha-based incendiary devices, to demoralize the Hungarians. While Batu led the main assault across the bridge, Subutai famously led a separate force in a flanking maneuver, crossing the river at an unexpected point. The Hungarian army, caught in a vice, was utterly destroyed. King Bela barely escaped with his life, fleeing into Dalmatia. The victories at Legnica and Mohi shattered European illusions of invincibility. The Mongol advance seemed unstoppable. They had reached the Adriatic Sea, and the path to Western Europe lay open. Panic gripped the continent. However, just as the future of Europe seemed grim, an unexpected event intervened. In December 1241, word reached the Mongol armies that Ogedai Khan had died in Karakorum. According to Mongol tradition, all senior princes and generals were required to return to the Mongol heartland for the Kurultai, the great assembly to elect the next great Khan. This sudden recall saved Western Europe from further devastation. While some historians argued that the Mongol advance had simply reached its logistical limits, with overextended supply lines and fierce local resistance, the death of Ogedai undeniably halted the Western campaigns. It bought Europe precious time, a reprieve from the scourge of God. The Mongols had demonstrated their capability to conquer deep into Europe, a chilling reminder of what could have been. The sudden recall of the Mongol armies from the frontiers of Europe, triggered by Ogedai Khan's death, saved the continent from a deeper invasion, but it did not diminish the conquests already achieved in the West. You are now observing the consolidation of the Mongol presence in the lands that would become the core of the Golden Horde. Imagine a vast, sprawling territory stretching from the forests of Russia to the steppes of Central Asia, overseen by the descendants of Chokhi, Genghis Khan's eldest son. This wasn't just a military occupation. It was the establishment of a powerful semi-independent Khanate that would dominate Eastern Europe for centuries. The architect of this new Mongol realm in the West was Batu Khan, Chokhi's son, and the general who had nominally led the Grand Western Campaign, though, as we discussed, Subutai did most of the heavy lifting strategically. Batu was a formidable figure in his own right, shrewd and ambitious. After the Kurultai that elected Guyuk as Great Khan, we'll get to that in a moment, Batu returned to his ulus, the lands allocated to his branch of the family. He understood that while the Great Khan in Karakorum held supreme authority, the sheer distances and the distinct nature of his new territories required a significant degree of autonomy. Batu established his capital at Sarai, a city that would grow into a vibrant hub on the lower Volga River, becoming a major center for trade and administration. From here, the Golden Horde, as it would come to be known, exerted its dominion over the various Russ's principalities. This wasn't direct Mongol rule in the sense of appointing Mongol governors to every town. Instead, it was a system of vassalage and tribute. The Russ's princes were allowed to maintain their own rule, but they were required to acknowledge the suzerainty of the Golden Horde, pay heavy annual tribute, the Mongol yoke, and send their princes to Sarai, and sometimes even further to Karakorum, to pledge fealty and receive their yarliks, or charters of authority. Imagine a medieval version of going to the main office to get your quarterly performance review. Except if you failed, your city might burn. This system, while economically draining and politically humiliating for the Rus, allowed the Mongols to control vast territories with a relatively small administrative footprint. They collected taxes drafted conscripts for their armies and kept the Russ's princes from unifying against them by often playing them against each other. For example, if one prince showed too much ambition, the Mongols might back a rival or even launch a punitive expedition. It was a classic divide and conquer strategy, keeping their subjects weak and disunited. The Golden Horde itself was a complex entity. It wasn't just Mongols. It comprised a diverse mix of Turkic peoples, including the Cumans, many of whom had been absorbed into the Mongol army and population, Kipchaks, and Volga Bulgars. Over time, these groups intermingled, leading to the gradual Turkification of the Golden Horde and the eventual adoption of Islam as its primary religion. This cultural evolution meant that while the ruling elite retained their Mongol identity, the broader population and culture became increasingly Turkic and Islamic. Economically, the Golden Horde thrived on trade. Sarai became a crucial nexus on the Silk Road, linking east and west. Goods flowed through its territories, from furs and timber, from the northern forests, to silks and spices from China and the Middle East. The Mongols, ever pragmatic, understood the value of secure trade routes, and their peace, the Pax Mongolica, facilitated this commerce, even if it was extracted through heavy taxation. Militarily, the Golden Horde remained a formidable power. Their cavalry, a mix of Mongol and Turkic warriors, continued to be a potent force capable of launching devastating raids into neighboring territories. They frequently intervened in Russ's internal affairs, launching punitive expeditions when tribute was late or defiance was shown. Their reputation for ferocity kept the Russ's princes in line for centuries. However, despite its power, the Golden Horde also faced internal challenges. The vastness of its territory, the slow but steady cultural assimilation, and the inherent rivalries among the Jochid descendants would eventually lead to fragmentation. But for now, under Batu Khan, it was a unified and dominant force in Eastern Europe. Its very existence meant that Europe was forever wary of the Tatar yoke, and the political and cultural development of Russia was profoundly shaped by this prolonged period of Mongol overlordship. Historians still argue whether the Mongol invasion and the Golden Horde's rule fundamentally retarded Russia's development, or perhaps ironically, solidified a centralized power structure that would eventually allow Moscow to become the dominant Russ's principality. So, while the immediate threat to Western Europe had receded, the shadow of the Mongol Empire, personified by the Golden Horde, lingered for centuries. It was a constant reminder of the destructive power of a unified nomadic force and a testament to the enduring legacy of Genghis Khan's ambition, now carried forward by his grandchildren. While Batu Khan was establishing the Golden Horde in the west, back in the Mongol heartland, the empire was facing the critical task of choosing its next supreme leader. You are now observing a period of intense political maneuvering and suspense, a high-stakes game of thrones for the great Khan. Ogedai's death in 1241 had triggered the requirement for a new Kurultai, and this grand assembly, delayed by various factors, finally convened in 1246. The interregnum, the period between Ogedai's death and the election of his successor, was fraught with tension. Ogedai's widow, Turagene Khatun, served as regent. She was a shrewd and ambitious woman, determined to secure the succession for her son, Kuyuk. However, this wasn't a unanimous choice. The various branches of the Genghis Khanate family, particularly the descendants of Genghis Khan's other sons, Jochi, Chagatai, and Tului, each had their own ambitions and preferred candidates. Batu Khan, for instance, a powerful figure in the West, had a strained relationship with Kuyuk and did not attend the Kurultai, a significant snub that highlighted the growing fault lines within the empire. Imagine thousands of Mongol notables, tribal leaders, and foreign envoys converging on Karakorum. The process of electing a great Khan wasn't a simple vote. It involved intricate negotiations, behind-the-scenes lobbying, and a lot of feasting and ceremony. Töregene Katun, through skillful diplomacy and lavish gifts, managed to sway enough support for her son. She essentially ran a very effective, very expensive political campaign, ensuring Kuyuk had the votes, or rather, the assent. In 1246, after much deliberation and political wrangling, Kuyuk Khan was formally enthroned as the third great Khan. His ascension was marked by immense pomp and ceremony, meant to project an image of undisputed authority and divine favor. Envoys from across the known world were present, including the famous Franciscan friar John of Plano Carpini, who provided one of the earliest and most detailed European accounts of the Mongols. He basically got a front row seat to medieval history in the making. Kuyuk's reign, however, was destined to be remarkably short and largely marked by internal conflicts rather than grand conquests. He was a rather sickly man, plagued by illness throughout his life. More significantly, he harbored deep resentment towards Batu Khan, his powerful cousin in the West. This animosity stemmed from long-standing personal feuds and rivalries from their shared campaigns. Kuyuk suspected Batu of disloyalty and viewed his absence from the Kurultai as a direct challenge to his authority. This simmering hostility between Kuyuk and Batu was a critical development. It represented the first major crack in the unified structure of the Mongol Empire established by Genghis Khan and Ögedei. While the empire was still nominally unified under the Great Khan, the practical reality was that the various ulus, appanages or khanates, were beginning to assert more autonomy. Historians still argue whether this internal strife was an inevitable consequence of the empire's vastness, or if Kuyuk's personality simply exacerbated existing tensions. Kuyuk, determined to assert his authority, began to take steps that alienated other powerful factions. He reversed some of his mother Töregene's policies and began to purge officials whom he considered disloyal. He also harbored suspicions of the Ögedei lineage, including some of his own relatives. This created an atmosphere of fear and instability within the court. It was less like a harmonious imperial family and more like a particularly cutthroat family reunion where everyone's eyeing the inheritance. His strained relationship with Batu reached a critical point. Kuyuk began to muster his forces, ostensibly for a campaign in the West, but many suspected his true intention was to confront Batu Khan and bring the Golden Horde to heel. The stage was set for a potential civil war, a catastrophic conflict that could have torn the nascent empire apart. However, fate intervened. In 1248, while traveling westward, presumably to confront Batu, Kuyuk Khan died. Again, the circumstances are somewhat mysterious. Some accounts suggest illness, others foul play. His death, after a mere 2 years on the throne, plunged the empire into another regency period, this time under his widow, Ogul Kaimush. This second interregnum proved even more turbulent than the first, with intense power struggles and factions vying for control. Kuyuk's brief reign, though lacking the grand military triumphs of his predecessors, was significant for what it foreshadowed. It highlighted the fragility of the Mongol unity, despite the strong foundations laid by Genghis Khan. The personal animosities and rivalries among the various branches of the imperial family, particularly between the descendants of Yoki and Ogadai, were becoming increasingly pronounced. While the empire still held together, the seeds of its eventual fragmentation were clearly being sown. The brief, troubled reign of Kuyuk served as a stark warning. Ruling an empire forged by conquest was one thing. Maintaining it through peace was quite another. Kuyuk Khan's untimely death in 1248 plunged the Mongol Empire into another turbulent interregnum. You are now witnessing a pivotal moment, a shift in the balance of power that would determine the future trajectory of the vast Mongol domain. This time, the regency under Ogul Kaimush, Kuyuk's widow, was even more chaotic and ineffective than Toregenes, marked by rampant corruption and a severe erosion of central authority. The powerful royal princes, fed up with the squabbling and inefficiency, knew a new decisive hand was needed. The stage was set for another Kurultai, and this time, the Toluids, the descendants of Genghis Khan's youngest son, Tolui, who had famously inherited the Mongol homeland, seized their opportunity. They formed a powerful alliance with the Hochids, led by Batu Khan himself. Remember the bad blood between Kuyuk and Batu? With Kuyuk gone, Batu was determined to prevent another hostile Ogadade from taking the throne. He threw his considerable weight and prestige behind the Toluid candidate, Monke. Monke was the eldest son of Tolui and the fearsome Sorkaktani Beki, a woman of extraordinary intelligence and political acumen. She had skillfully navigated the treacherous currents of court politics, cultivating alliances and ensuring her sons were positioned for power. Imagine a grand chess match, and Sorgaktani Beki was playing several moves ahead of everyone else. The Kurultai that elected Monke, held in 1251, was controversial. Many Ogadade and Chagatai princes refused to attend, protesting the legitimacy of the assembly, as it was not held in the traditional Ogadade heartland and was largely orchestrated by Batu Khan. However, with Batu's overwhelming military and political support, Monke's ascension was secured. He was a seasoned warrior, intelligent, and known for his adherence to the Yassa, Genghis Khan's law code. His election marked a major shift in the imperial lineage, transferring the great Khanate from the Ogadide line to the Toluid line. It was like a hostile takeover, but with more horses and less paperwork. Monke Khan, reigning from 1251 to 1259, immediately set about consolidating his power and restoring order to the empire. His reign is often characterized by significant administrative reforms and a renewed drive for expansion. He understood that the empire, vast as it was, needed more than just military might. It needed a stable revenue base and efficient governance to endure. One of Monke's first acts was to launch a sweeping purge of the Ogadeid and Chagatai factions who had opposed his ascension. This was a brutal but effective way to eliminate rivals and solidify his authority. Many princes and officials deemed disloyal were executed or exiled, and their lands and wealth were confiscated. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about ensuring that future challenges to the Toluid lineage would be impossible. It was a strong message. Don't mess with the new boss. Administratively, Mongke continued Ogadai's efforts to centralize control and regularize taxation. He ordered a comprehensive census of the entire empire, a monumental undertaking that spanned years and provided a detailed accounting of populations and resources. This census was crucial for establishing a fairer and more consistent tax system, replacing the ad hoc levies that had caused much resentment. He also tried to curb the rampant corruption that had flourished during the regencies, implementing stricter controls and punishments for dishonest officials. Mongke also took steps to improve the empire's infrastructure. He continued the expansion of the Yam postal system, making it even more efficient, ensuring that messages and goods could travel swiftly across his vast domains. He also invested in road construction and the establishment of new trade routes, further facilitating the Pax Mongolica. He understood that a well-connected empire was a well-controlled one. Crucially, Mongke reignited the spirit of conquest that had somewhat waned during the interregnums. He decided to pursue two massive campaigns, each aimed at significant, unconquered territories. His own brother, Hulagu, was dispatched to the southwest to conquer the remnants of the Islamic world, a region stretching from Persia to Egypt. And another of his brothers, the future Kublai Khan, was sent to the southeast to complete the conquest of the southern Song dynasty in China. These were enormous undertakings, demonstrating Mongke's ambition to fulfill Genghis Khan's vision of universal dominion. Historians still debate whether Mongke's renewed focus on conquest was a deliberate return to the roots of the empire, or simply a pragmatic way to utilize his powerful, restless armies. Mongke Khan's reign was a period of robust central authority, renewed administrative efficiency, and ambitious military expansion. He was a stern but just ruler, respected for his intellect and his commitment to the Yassa. He brought a degree of stability and purpose back to the Mongol Empire after years of infighting and political drift. He set the stage for two of the most significant conquests in Mongol history, campaigns that would drastically alter the geopolitical landscape of Asia and beyond. His rule was a powerful reminder that the Mongol Empire, despite its internal squabbles, was still a force to be reckoned with, capable of unleashing its full might on the world. Under Mongke Khan's renewed vision of conquest, the western wing of the Mongol war machine was set into motion, targeting the heartlands of the Islamic world. You are now about to witness one of the most devastating and culturally significant campaigns in human history, the destruction of the Abbasid Caliphate and the fall of Baghdad. This was not just a military expansion. It was a cataclysm that reshaped the Middle East and sent ripples through the entire Islamic world. Mongke entrusted this monumental task to his brother, Hulagu Khan. Hulagu was a formidable general, known for his relentless determination and brutal efficiency, much like his grandfather, Genghis Khan. His mission was clear: to establish firm Mongol rule over the southwestern lands, which effectively meant bringing the powerful but declining Abbasid Caliphate and the various independent states of Persia and Syria under Mongol dominion. This wasn't a quick raid. It was a deliberate, systematic conquest aimed at permanence. Hulagu set out in 1253 with a massive army, bolstered by contingents from his brothers and cousins Ulus, showcasing the continued, albeit strained, unity of the Mongol imperial family under Mongke. His campaign began with the methodical subjugation of various minor Persian states, and notably, the destruction of the formidable assassins, the Nizari Ismailis. These mysterious sectarians, based in their impregnable mountain fortresses like Alamut, had for centuries terrified rulers with their political assassinations. Hulagu, however, understood siege warfare better than anyone. His engineers and sappers, many of them Chinese, meticulously dismantled the fortresses, bringing an end to the assassins' reign of terror in 1256. It was a testament to Mongol persistence and their advanced siegecraft. If you thought your latest home renovation project was tough, try knocking down a medieval fortress with nothing but rocks and sheer willpower. With the assassins removed, the path to the jewel of the Middle East lay open: Baghdad. For centuries, Baghdad had been the magnificent capital of the Abbasid Caliphate, a beacon of Islamic learning, art, and science. It housed vast libraries, grand mosques, and scholars whose knowledge stretched across fields. It was the cultural and spiritual heart of Sunni Islam, a city of unparalleled wealth and prestige. Its ruler, Caliph al-Mustasim, however, was weak and indecisive, relying more on diplomacy and spiritual authority than military strength. Hulagu, ever pragmatic, sent an ultimatum to the Caliph in 1257, demanding his surrender and the dismantling of Baghdad's fortifications. The Caliph, arrogant and misguided, foolishly refused, confident in the city's strong walls and the non-existent support he believed he would receive from other Muslim rulers. This was a fatal miscalculation. You simply did not defy the Mongols, especially not after they'd just cleared out a bunch of highly effective assassins. The siege of Baghdad began in January 1258. The Mongol army, numbering in the tens of thousands and augmented by Christian contingents, including Georgians and Armenians, who saw the campaign as a holy war against their Muslim overlords, completely encircled the city. The siege was brutal and relatively short, lasting only a couple of weeks. The Mongols employed a variety of siege engines, constantly bombarding the walls, while also systematically destroying any sallying parties. On February 10th, 1258, Baghdad fell. The ensuing sack was one of the most horrific events in human history. For days, the Mongols unleashed their fury on the city. Libraries were burned, their priceless manuscripts tossed into the Tigris until the river reportedly ran black with ink. Mosques were desecrated, palaces plundered, and the vast population massacred. Estimates of the dead vary wildly, but they run into the hundreds of thousands. The Caliph al-Mustasim was captured and executed, reportedly rolled in a carpet and trampled to death by horses, a method designed to avoid spilling royal blood onto the ground, a Mongol superstition. The destruction of Baghdad marked the symbolic end of the Islamic Golden Age. The Abbasid Caliphate, which had endured for over 500 years, was extinguished. The intellectual and cultural heart of the Muslim world was gutted, and it would take centuries for the region to recover. Historians still argue whether the destruction of Baghdad was a deliberate act to cripple Islamic civilization, or simply an unfortunate consequence of Mongol military policy towards resistant cities. Regardless, the impact was profound and long-lasting. After Baghdad, Hulagu continued his westward advance. His forces conquered Syria, taking Aleppo and Damascus in 1260, often aided by local Christian populations eager to throw off Muslim rule. The road to Egypt, the last major Islamic power standing, seemed open. Hulagu established the Ilkhanate in Persia, another major Mongol Khanate, a vast dominion that would profoundly influence the cultural and political development of Iran for centuries. However, just as his armies prepared to invade Egypt, Hulagu received critical news. His brother, Mongol Khan, had died in China in 1259. Like Batu's recall from Europe, this necessitated the return of many of his senior generals and a significant portion of his army to Karakorum for the Kurultai to elect the next great Khan. Hulagu himself remained in the Middle East, leaving only a smaller force under his general Kitbuka to hold the newly conquered territories. This sudden withdrawal would prove to be a crucial turning point, setting the stage for the first major Mongol defeat. The tide, which had seemed so unstoppable, was about to turn. As Hulagu Khan departed from the Middle East, summoned by the grim news of his brother Munka's death, he left behind a relatively small Mongol force to hold the vast, newly conquered territories. You are now about to witness a moment of profound historical significance. The first decisive defeat of a major Mongol army. This wasn't just a skirmish. It was a battle that shattered the myth of Mongol invincibility and altered the geopolitical landscape of the Eastern Mediterranean. The Mongol forces remaining in the Levant were commanded by Kitbuka, a seasoned Nestorian Christian general, utterly loyal to Hulagu. Kitbuka continued the Mongol advance, pushing deeper into Syria, with their sights set on Egypt, the last great power in the Islamic world not yet under Mongol dominion. Egypt was ruled by the Mamluks, a unique military caste composed primarily of Turkic slave soldiers, renowned for their fierce martial prowess and unwavering loyalty to their sultan. They had proven themselves formidable defenders against the Crusader states, and now they stood as the last line of defense against the Mongol tide. The Mamluk Sultan at the time was Qutuz, a shrewd and determined leader. He understood the existential threat posed by the Mongols. He knew that the usual Mamluk internal squabbles had to be set aside. In a desperate plea for unity, he rallied his forces, even reconciling with a former rival, the skilled commander Baibars, who would later become a legendary sultan himself. Imagine the desperate resolve of a people facing an enemy who had just annihilated the caliphate itself. They knew the stakes were absolute. The two armies converged in the Jezreel Valley, near a place called Ain Jalut, Goliath's Spring, in what is now northern Israel. The date was September 3rd, 1260. The Mamluk army, though perhaps numerically smaller than the full Mongol host, was well led, highly motivated, and fighting for the survival of their faith and homeland. Kitbuka, despite his military experience, may have underestimated the Mamluks, or perhaps he was overconfident due to the Mongols' unbroken string of victories. Historians still argue whether Kitbuka's limited numbers were truly a fatal handicap, or if Mamluk tactical superiority and motivation were the decisive factors. The Mamluk strategy was masterful. Baibars, leading the Mamluk vanguard, employed the classic Mongol tactic of the feigned retreat. He engaged the Mongol forces, then pretended to flee, drawing Kitbuka's cavalry into a prepared ambush in a narrow valley surrounded by hills. As the Mongols pursued, they found themselves caught between the Mamluk main army, waiting in ambush, and the flanking Mamluk forces. The Mamluk cavalry, using their disciplined charges and their superior understanding of the local terrain, launched a devastating counterattack. The battle was fierce and bloody. The Mamluks, fighting with desperation and skill, eventually broke the Mongol lines. Kitbuka, refusing to flee, fought valiantly until he was captured and executed. His death was a massive blow, not just militarily, but psychologically. It sent an unmistakable message. The Mongols were not invincible. You could, in fact, beat them if you were smart, united, and brave enough. It was like seeing the final boss in a video game suddenly run out of health for the first time. The victory at Ain Jalut was monumental. It halted the Mongol westward expansion definitively. Had the Mongols pressed into Egypt, the entire political and cultural landscape of North Africa and the Mediterranean would have been irrevocably altered. The Mamluks effectively acted as a shield, protecting Egypt and, by extension, much of the rest of North Africa and the Arabian Peninsula from Mongol conquest. The Mamluks followed up their victory with a systematic expulsion of the remaining Mongol forces from Syria. The Ilkhanate, established by Hulagu, now found its western frontier fixed at the Euphrates River, unable to expand further. The defeat also had profound implications for the political dynamics within the Mongol Empire itself. Hulagu, back in Persia, establishing the Ilkhanate, was infuriated by the loss, but was consumed by the brewing civil war back in the Mongol heartland, the Toluid Civil War, which we'll discuss soon, preventing him from immediately launching a full-scale retaliatory campaign. Ain Jalut served as a powerful symbol of resistance. It showed that disciplined, motivated armies employing intelligent tactics could indeed stand up to the once unstoppable Mongol war machine. It also solidified the Mamluks' position as the preeminent power in the Islamic Middle East for the next 2 centuries. They became the defenders of Islam, revered for their role in stopping the Mongol advance. For the Mongols, Ain Jalut was a humbling experience, a stark reminder that even their formidable power had limits. It forced a strategic reassessment and marked the beginning of a period where the various Mongol Khanates would increasingly fight amongst themselves rather than continually expanding outwards. The universal empire was showing its cracks, and the Mamluks, almost single-handedly, had put the first significant dent in its seemingly impenetrable armor. While the Mamluks were making history at Ain Jalut, far to the east, the Mongol Empire was undergoing another monumental transformation. You're now turning your attention to the rise of Kublai Khan, a figure whose vision would dramatically shift the focus of the Mongol Empire from nomadic conquest to settled imperial rule. fundamentally altering its character and ushering in a new era. Kublai was another grandson of Genghis Khan, a son of Tolui, and thus Mongol Khan's younger brother. Unlike many of his warrior kin, Kublai possessed a keen intellectual curiosity and a deep fascination with Chinese culture and administration. While his brothers were busy conquering distant lands, Kublai was studying the intricacies of Chinese governance, Confucian philosophy, and the practicalities of ruling a vast agrarian society. He recognized that China wasn't just a territory to be plundered. It was a civilization to be mastered and governed. It was less about smashing things and more about building a really big, well-oiled machine. His opportunity came when his brother Mongol Khan assigned him the task of conquering the southern Song dynasty. Remember the Jin Dynasty? The Mongols had conquered their northern half. Now, the wealthy and culturally vibrant southern Song, controlling the richest and most populous parts of China, remained. This was an immense undertaking, a generation-long struggle against a sophisticated and populous empire. Mongol's death in 1259, while campaigning in China, plunged the Mongol Empire into yet another succession crisis. But this one was different. It triggered a full-blown civil war known as the Toluid Civil War between Kublai and his younger brother, Arikbüke. Arikbüke, upholding traditional Mongol nomadic values, was elected Great Khan at a Kurultai in Mongolia by the conservative Mongol factions. Kublai, however, had the support of the Mongol forces in China and the backing of his powerful mother, Sorgaktani Beki's legacy. He quickly convened his own Kurultai in Kaiping, China, where he too proclaimed himself Great Khan. This was a direct challenge to Mongol tradition and a clear sign of the growing schism within the empire. Kublai's decision to base himself in China and embrace Chinese administrative methods further alienated the traditionalist Mongols, who viewed his adoption of settled ways as a betrayal of their nomadic heritage. The civil war lasted for 4 arduous years, 1260–1264, a devastating conflict that drained Mongol resources and led to internal strife. Ultimately, Kublai, with his superior access to Chinese resources and manpower, prevailed. Arikbüke surrendered in 1264, solidifying Kublai's position as the dominant, though not universally accepted, Great Khan. With his position secured, Kublai Khan embarked on his grand project, the complete conquest of the southern Song dynasty and the establishment of a new imperial order in China. This was no quick campaign. It was a slow, methodical war of attrition, lasting until 1279. The southern Song, despite their military weaknesses, were tenacious and resourceful, possessing a large navy and formidable defenses along their rivers. Kublai, however, applied a different approach than his predecessors. While still capable of brutality, he emphasized Chinese methods of governance and administration. He utilized Chinese engineers for siege warfare, Chinese scribes for bureaucracy, and even incorporated Chinese troops into his army. He fostered economic recovery in northern China, promoting agriculture and trade, and showed a pragmatic respect for Chinese culture and scholarship, inviting Confucian scholars to his court. He built a new capital at Dadu, modern-day Beijing, a magnificent city designed along traditional Chinese lines, signaling his intention to rule China as a Chinese emperor, not merely a foreign conqueror. In 1271, Kublai Khan formally proclaimed the establishment of the Yuan dynasty, meaning origin or beginning, adopting a traditional Chinese dynastic name. This was a profound symbolic act, indicating his legitimacy as a Chinese emperor, even though he was ethnically Mongol. He was, in essence, trying to have his nomadic cake and eat it with Chinese imperial frosting. The final conquest of the southern Song involved massive naval operations, as the Mongols had to overcome the Song's powerful fleets and riverine defenses. They built their own navies, often using captured Song shipwrights and sailors. The decisive moment came at the Battle of Yamen in 1279, a massive naval engagement that saw the last remnants of the southern Song fleet destroyed. The last Song emperor, a young boy, perished, bringing an end to the Song dynasty. Kublai Khan's reign was a period of unprecedented prosperity and cultural exchange in China. He opened China to the outside world, fostering trade along the Silk Road, and even welcoming European travelers like Marco Polo, whose accounts famously describe the wonders of Kublai's court and the wealth of his empire. Under Kublai, the Yuan dynasty saw significant public works projects, advancements in science and technology, and a flourishing of arts. Historians still argue whether Kublai truly assimilated into Chinese culture, or if he merely adopted its trappings as a pragmatic means of governance, while maintaining his Mongol identity and privilege for his elite. Kublai Khan's legacy is complex. He completed the Mongol conquest of China, but in doing so, he fundamentally changed the nature of the Mongol Empire. He shifted its center of gravity to China, away from the nomadic steppes, and transformed it into a more settled, bureaucratic, and distinctly Chinese-influenced imperial power. This emphasis on sedentary rule, however, further deepened the divisions within the broader Mongol Empire, as the Western Khanates increasingly viewed the Yuan dynasty as distinct and even alien. With the southern Song dynasty finally subdued and the Yuan dynasty firmly established in China, Kublai Khan, now truly a universal emperor in the Eastern sense, set his sights on new horizons. You are now observing the pinnacle of his imperial ambition, a grand naval undertaking that would test the very limits of Mongol power. The attempts to conquer Japan. Imagine the sheer scale of the vision. The Mongols, traditionally land-based warriors, had built an empire on horseback. Now Kublai Khan, with the vast resources and shipbuilding expertise of newly conquered China at his disposal, envisioned extending his dominion across the seas. He saw Japan, a seemingly wealthy island nation, as another natural extension of his burgeoning empire. It was a classic because it's there kind of ambition, combined with the desire to secure his eastern flanks and perhaps fulfill the Genghis Khanid prophecy of universal rule over all lands. Kublai's initial approach to Japan was diplomatic. In the early 1260s and 1270s, he sent several envoys to Japan, demanding that the Japanese shogun acknowledge his suzerainty and pay tribute. His messages were polite, yet firm, implicitly backed by the formidable power of the Yuan dynasty. However, the Japanese, fiercely independent and confident in their island's natural defenses, were having none of it. The Kamakura shogunate, particularly the regent Hojo Tokimune, repeatedly rejected Kublai's demands, even executing some of his envoys. This was a direct insult, a challenge that Kublai, as a self-proclaimed universal ruler, could not ignore. You simply didn't tell a Mongol Khan no, especially not when they had a freshly built navy and a whole lot of spare time. The first Mongol invasion of Japan came in 1274. This was a combined force of around 15,000 to 40,000 Mongol, Chinese, and Korean troops, carried on a fleet of several hundred ships. They landed at Hakata Bay on Kyushu Island. The Japanese, with their samurai warriors, fought bravely. However, they were initially overwhelmed by the Mongols' superior tactics, which included disciplined unit formations, the use of composite bows, and early forms of gunpowder weapons, primitive grenades. This was a stark contrast to the Japanese individualistic combat style. The Mongol invasion force won several skirmishes on land, but their stay was short-lived. A sudden and fierce typhoon struck Hakata Bay. This was not a gentle summer breeze. It was a devastating storm that wrecked a significant portion of the Mongol fleet, drowning thousands of soldiers and forcing the survivors to retreat. The Japanese saw this as divine intervention, a kami no kaze, or divine wind, which is where the term kamikaze originates. This first attempt, while a scare for the Japanese, was ultimately a failure for Kublai Khan. It was less like a conquest and more like a very expensive, very wet picnic. Undeterred by this setback, Kublai Khan was determined to succeed. He spent years meticulously preparing for a second, much larger invasion. He poured vast resources into shipbuilding, constructing an enormous fleet, a truly colossal undertaking involving hundreds of thousands of laborers. This second invasion force was gargantuan, estimated at up to 140,000 troops, carried on thousands of ships. This was arguably the largest naval expedition in history before the D-Day landings of World War II. The second invasion was launched in 1281. The Mongols again targeted Hakata Bay. This time, the Japanese were better prepared. They had spent the intervening years building a defensive stone wall along Hakata Bay designed to thwart Mongol landings. They also had a more organized defense and a clear strategy of engaging the Mongol ships at sea or immediately upon landing, preventing them from establishing a solid beachhead. The fighting was fierce and protracted. The Japanese samurai, with their close-quarters combat skills, proved effective against the Mongols in land skirmishes, while their smaller, faster ships engaged the larger, more cumbersome Mongol vessels in naval battles. The Mongols found it difficult to deploy their land-based tactics effectively in the coastal and island environment. However, once again, the forces of nature intervened. After weeks of stalemate and intense fighting, another massive typhoon struck, even more powerful than the first. This divine wind utterly annihilated the Mongol fleet. Ships were dashed against the shore, thousands of soldiers drowned, and the vast expeditionary force was almost completely destroyed. It was an unprecedented maritime disaster, a catastrophic end to Kublai Khan's ambitions of conquering Japan. Historians still argue whether the typhoons were the sole reason for the Mongol defeat, or if the Japanese resistance and tactical ingenuity would have eventually repelled the invaders regardless. But for the Japanese, it was a clear sign of divine protection. The failed invasions of Japan were a tremendous blow to Kublai Khan's prestige and resources. They demonstrated the limits of Mongol power, particularly when faced with maritime challenges and the unpredictable forces of nature. The immense financial and human cost of these expeditions strained the Yuan dynasty's treasury and contributed to growing discontent within China. While Kublai Khan would continue to rule his vast Yuan dynasty with skill and vision for many more years, the failure to conquer Japan marked the end of the Mongol Empire's outward territorial expansion. The dream of universal dominion, extending even across the seas, had been definitively shattered. It was a reminder that even the most formidable land-based empire had its boundaries, often defined by the unforgiving power of the ocean. While Kublai Khan was building his grand Yuan dynasty and battling typhoons in the east, the other great Mongol Khanates were also evolving, often along their own distinct paths. You are now observing the gradual process of fragmentation within the Mongol Empire. As the unity forged by Genghis Khan slowly gave way to independent regional powers, our focus shifts to the Ilkhanate, the Mongol realm in Persia. A fascinating blend of Mongol power and Persian culture that ultimately succumbed to internal strife and economic woes. The Ilkhanate was founded by Hulagu Khan, Mongke Khan's brother, who, as you'll recall, was the architect of the devastating campaigns that sacked Baghdad and ended the Abbasid Caliphate. After Mongke's death and the ensuing Toluid civil war, Hulagu remained in Persia. Recognizing that his vast conquests and the sheer distance from Karakorum necessitated an independent base of power, he formally established the Ilkhanate in 1260, declaring himself Ilkhan, meaning subordinate Khan, to the Great Khan, initially Mongke, then Kublai, a symbolic nod to the theoretical unity of the empire. But in practice, the Ilkhanate was largely autonomous. The Ilkhanate spanned a vast territory encompassing Persia, Iraq, parts of Afghanistan, and much of present-day Turkey, Anatolia. It was a region of immense historical and cultural significance, with a rich Persian Islamic heritage. The initial years of Mongol rule were marked by considerable destruction and brutal suppression, particularly in Iraq and Syria, as evidenced by the fall of Baghdad. However, over time the Ilkhans, like Kublai in China, began to adopt aspects of the local culture and administration, albeit unevenly. One of the most significant developments in the Ilkhanate was the gradual conversion of the Mongol ruling elite to Islam. While the early Ilkhans, including Hulagu, largely adhered to Tengrism, or even showed some sympathy for Buddhism due to Mongol connections with Tibet, the majority of their subjects were Muslim. Over decades, through intermarriage, the influence of Sufi mystics, and the sheer cultural weight of Persian civilization, the Mongol Khans and nobles began to embrace Islam. This process culminated in the early 14th century with the conversion of Ghazan Khan in 1295, making Islam the official religion of the Ilkhanate. Imagine a conquering force slowly adopting the religion of the conquered, a truly profound shift. This conversion, however, alienated the Ilkhanate from the Golden Horde, who remained largely Tengrist at this point, further deepening the existing animosities between these two Mongol realms. Economically, the Ilkhanate faced significant challenges. The initial Mongol conquests had devastated agricultural lands and disrupted traditional trade routes. The Mongols' heavy taxation and the lack of effective administrative structures in the early years led to economic decline and widespread suffering among the peasantry. Efforts were made to reform the tax system and promote agriculture, particularly under later Ilkhans like Ghazan, who introduced significant reforms to stabilize the economy and rebuild infrastructure. Think of it as a medieval stimulus package, though probably less effective than your government's. The Ilkhanate was also constantly embroiled in external conflicts. They engaged in a protracted and often bitter rivalry with the Mamluks of Egypt, fighting a series of battles for control of Syria and the Levant. Remember Ain Jalut? The Ilkhans sought revenge for that humiliating defeat. But despite several attempts, they were never able to decisively overcome the Mamluks. These wars were costly, draining the Ilkhanate's resources and preventing further westward expansion. Internally, the Ilkhanate, despite its initial strength, suffered from the same problem that plagued all Mongol successor states: succession disputes. The vast territory and the inherent ambition of the various Genghis Khanate princes led to frequent power struggles and civil wars. These internal conflicts weakened the central authority of the Ilkhan, leading to a proliferation of local warlords and a decline in administrative effectiveness. It was less like a stable kingdom and more like a never-ending season of Survivor Mongol edition. By the early 14th century, the Ilkhanate was in decline. The succession disputes intensified, the economy continued to struggle, and the Mongol ruling elite, increasingly assimilated into Persian society, lost some of their martial edge. The death of the last effective Ilkhan, Abu Sa'id, in 1335, marked the official end of the dynasty. The Ilkhanate then fragmented into numerous smaller, often warring successor states ruled by various Mongol and Turkic warlords. The legacy of the Ilkhanate is a complex one. While it brought immense destruction in its early years, it also fostered a unique cultural synthesis. Persian art, architecture, and scholarship flourished under Mongol patronage, blending indigenous traditions with Central Asian and even Chinese influences. Major scientific advancements, particularly in astronomy and medicine, occurred during this period. However, its decline illustrates the inherent challenge of maintaining a vast, diverse empire. When central authority weakens and internal divisions take precedence over the grand vision of universal conquest, the vast empire was slowly but surely unwinding. As the Ilkhanate in Persia grappled with its own decline, another massive fragment of the Mongol Empire, the Golden Horde in Eastern Europe, was facing its own set of formidable challenges. You are now observing the slow, often painful process of disintegration within the westernmost Mongol Khanate, a story of internal feuds, external pressures, and the gradual resurgence of the conquered. The Golden Horde, remember, was founded by Batu Khan, Jochi's son, and its vast domain stretched across the steppes of Eastern Europe and Central Asia, from the Carpathians to the Urals. For centuries, it exerted dominion over the Rus's principalities, collecting tribute and ensuring their submission through periodic punitive raids. At its height, It was a formidable military power, its cavalry still inspiring fear across the continent. Imagine a colossal medieval protection racket, and the Mongols were the undisputed bosses. However, the very vastness and diverse composition of the Golden Horde ultimately became its Achilles heel. Like the Ilkhanate, it suffered from severe succession disputes among the Jochid descendants. After Batu Khan's death, a series of Khans came and went, often deposed or assassinated by rivals. These internecine struggles, sometimes escalating into full-blown civil wars, severely weakened the central authority of the Golden Horde and led to a constant drain on its resources and manpower. It was a bit like a reality TV show, but with significantly higher stakes and more horse-mounted assassinations. These internal divisions coincided with increasing external pressures. The Rus's principalities, though still under the Mongol yoke, were slowly gaining strength and cohesion. Moscow, in particular, began to emerge as a dominant power, skillfully playing various Mongol factions against each other, while quietly consolidating its own territory and resources. The Golden Horde's internal strife provided the Rus's princes with opportunities to resist or delay tribute payments, and occasionally to even challenge the Mongols militarily. One of the most symbolic and famous moments of Rus's resistance came at the Battle of Kulikovo Field in 1380. A large united Rus's army, primarily from Moscow, under the leadership of Prince Dmitry Donskoy, inflicted a significant defeat on the Golden Horde forces led by Mamaya, a powerful general who was effectively ruling in place of a weak Khan. This wasn't the end of the Golden Horde's power. They would still sack Moscow again a few years later, but it was a crucial psychological victory for the Rus. It showed them that the Mongols were not invincible and that unity could, indeed, lead to success. Historians still argue whether Kulikovo was truly a turning point in the decline of the Golden Horde, or if it was more a symptom of a decline already underway. Beyond the Rus's lands, the Golden Horde also faced challenges from the rising power of Lithuania in the west and the various Turkic tribes on its southern and eastern flanks. The conversion of the Golden Horde's elite to Islam, which largely occurred later than in the Ilkhanate under Uzbek Khan in the early 14th century, further complicated its relationship with the predominantly Christian Rus and led to new ideological divides. Economically, the Golden Horde, like other Mongol realms, initially benefited from controlling vast trade routes. However, its constant internal conflicts, combined with the devastating effects of the Black Death in the mid-14th century, which ravaged populations across Eurasia, including the Mongol steppes, severely disrupted trade and agricultural production. The economic base eroded, making it harder for the Khans to maintain their armies and control their vast territories. By the late 14th and early 15th centuries, the Golden Horde had fractured into several smaller, independent Khanates, often referred to as the successor Khanates. These included the Khanate of Kazan, the Khanate of Astrakhan, the Khanate of Crimea, and the Siberian Khanate. These smaller entities continued to exist for varying lengths of time, often engaging in their own internal conflicts and external raids. The Mongol yoke over Russia finally ended symbolically in 1480 with the Great Stand on the Ugra River. The armies of Grand Prince Ivan III of Moscow and the Golden Horde's forces faced each other across the Ugra River for weeks, but no decisive battle occurred. Ultimately, the Mongol forces retreated, marking the effective end of Mongol dominion over Russia. This was less a glorious victory and more a quiet cessation of power, but it sealed the fate of the Golden Horde. The complete demise of the Golden Horde took centuries, with the last fragment, the Crimean Khanate, only falling to the Russian Empire in 1783. Its long decline is a stark illustration of how even the most formidable empires can be undone by a combination of internal strife, the rise of powerful neighbors, and demographic and economic pressures. The Golden Horde left an indelible mark on Russian history, influencing its political development, military organization, and even aspects of its culture. Its disintegration marked another crucial step in the unraveling of Genghis Khan's once unified world empire. As the Ilkhanate crumbled and the Golden Horde fractured, the final great chapter of the Mongol Empire's initial grand narrative was playing out in the very place where it had achieved its greatest splendor, China. You are now observing the inevitable decline and eventual fall of the Yuan dynasty, the magnificent empire founded by Kublai Khan. This was not a sudden collapse, but a protracted unraveling, driven by a complex interplay of internal failures and resurgent Chinese nationalism. Remember Kublai Khan's ambition. He had built Dadu, modern-day Beijing, a magnificent capital, and presided over a period of unprecedented cultural exchange and economic prosperity. But even during his long and generally successful reign, the seeds of the Yuan dynasty's downfall were being sown. The fundamental challenge was that the Mongols, a nomadic ruling elite, were attempting to govern a vast and ancient agrarian civilization with deeply ingrained traditions and a massive population that largely viewed them as foreign conquerors. It was a bit like trying to run a marathon in flip-flops. Eventually, something's going to give. After Kublai Khan's death in 1294, the Yuan dynasty entered a period of instability. His successors were generally less capable, often short-lived, and frequently embroiled in destructive succession struggles. The Yuan court became a hotbed of intrigue and factionalism, with powerful Mongol princes and Chinese officials vying for influence. This constant political infighting undermined central authority and led to widespread corruption, as officials exploited their positions for personal gain. Imagine a game of musical chairs, but the chairs are thrones and the music never stops, just gets increasingly discordant. Economically, the Yuan dynasty faced mounting problems. The massive expenditures on Kublai Khan's ambitious projects, including the failed invasions of Japan and Vietnam. Yes, they tried that too, another watery grave for Mongol ambition, and the building of Dadu strained the imperial treasury. Later emperors, seeking to alleviate financial woes, resorted to excessive printing of paper currency, which led to rampant inflation. This devalued the currency, disrupted trade, and caused widespread economic hardship for the populace. When your money becomes less valuable than the paper it's printed on, you know you're in trouble. Furthermore, a series of natural disasters plagued China in the 14th century. Frequent and devastating floods of the Yellow River, often exacerbated by the Mongols' neglect of traditional Chinese hydraulic engineering, led to crop failures, famine, and widespread displacement. The government's inability to effectively manage these disasters and provide relief further eroded its legitimacy in the eyes of the Chinese people, who traditionally expected their emperors to maintain the mandate of heaven by ensuring peace and prosperity. The Black Death, which swept across Eurasia in the mid-14th century, also played a devastating role. While its exact impact on China is debated, it undoubtedly contributed to demographic decline and further economic disruption, weakening the Yuan dynasty's grip on power. These accumulating grievances, economic distress, natural disasters, political corruption, and the enduring sense of foreign rule, fueled widespread discontent among the Chinese population. Secret societies and peasant rebellions began to emerge, the most prominent being the Red Turban Rebellion. These movements, often led by charismatic figures, tapped into deep-seated anti-Mongol sentiment and a desire to restore native Chinese rule. The most successful of these rebel leaders was a former peasant and Buddhist monk named Zhu Yuanzhang. He rose through the ranks of the Red Turbans, demonstrating remarkable military and organizational skill. Unlike other rebel leaders, Zhu Yuanzhang disciplined his troops, showing respect for the populace, and gained widespread popular support. He patiently consolidated his power, capturing territory and building a formidable army. By the 1360s, Zhu Yuanzhang's forces were the dominant rebel power. In 1368, he declared himself the first emperor of the Ming dynasty and launched a final, decisive campaign against the Yuan. The Mongol court, weakened by internal divisions and unable to effectively respond, offered little resistance. The last Yuan emperor, Togon Timur, abandoned Dadu and fled back to the Mongolian steppes. The great Yuan dynasty, which had ruled China for less than a century, had fallen. The Ming dynasty quickly consolidated its rule, restoring traditional Chinese systems of governance and culture, while the Mongols continued to exist as a powerful nomadic force on the steppes, now referred to as the Northern Yuan. Their direct rule over China was irrevocably over. The fall of the Yuan dynasty marked the final symbolic end of the unified Mongol Empire. While the successor Khanates continued to exist for centuries, some, like the Crimean Khanate, even into the 18th century, they were independent entities, no longer bound by a central authority in Karakorum or Beijing. The dream of Genghis Khan's universal empire had fragmented, leaving behind a complex legacy of destruction and innovation. A vast interconnected network of trade and cultural exchange, and a profound lasting impact on the history of Eurasia. And so, as the moonlight softly traces patterns on your window, and the world outside prepares for a new day, we close the book on this extraordinary chapter of human history. The thunder of hooves has faded, the cries of battle have long since silenced, and the grand ambitions of the Khans have returned to the dust from which they came. Yet, the echoes of their empire, in the very fabric of continents and the flow of history, remain. You can almost feel the whispers of those distant winds, carrying tales of a time when the world truly seemed to shrink under the shadow of a single unifying force. Sleep now, knowing that even the greatest empires eventually find their peace, their stories settling into the quiet, reassuring rhythm of the past.